Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a Greek mythology bedtime story that's not the shiny, happily ever after version you might remember. Picture this: the war is over, the fires of Troy still smoulder, and one man stands among the ruins with nothing left but the desperate hope of seeing home again. Odysseus. History remembers him as clever, a hero, but the truth is far messier and far more human. This is the Odyssey told in the quiet hours, where the waves are black. The gods are petty and cruel, and every mile toward Ithaca costs him pieces of his soul. Maybe you've heard the headlines of this tale before: Trojan horse, sirens, monsters. But have you ever wondered what it felt like? The smell of burnt wood and salt in his lungs. The weight of knowing you led men to victory only to watch them die on the long road home. The loneliness of a wife weaving by lamplight, never knowing if you still breathe. This isn't just mythology. It's the oldest kind of bedtime story, one meant to lull you into the dark with truth, sorrow, and a strange kind of comfort. If you've ever stared at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering if you'll make it through tomorrow, you'll find a piece of yourself in this journey. It's not just about gods and monsters. It's about endurance. It's about finding your way back when the whole world seems against you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Close with this line before you transition into the immersive story now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fires hadn't gone out. They breathed and cracked along the ribs of the ruined city, a slow burn that made the night smell like a wet hearth, left too long unattended. Pillars lay on their sides like snapped bones. A child's bronze toy wheel lay half buried in soot. Victory, in case you're wondering, doesn't smell like laurel. It smells like this. Odysseus didn't cheer. He stood ankle-deep in rubble, cloak torn, eyes raw from smoke and the kind of sleeplessness that doesn't come from coffee. The horse had worked, of course it had. You wheel a miracle into a city and pray no one asks questions until it's too late. Historians will argue for centuries whether that horse was a metaphor for a siege engine, a bribed gate, or just a really good story that stuck. Odysseus didn't care about footnotes. He saw what his cleverness had brought towers turned to teeth, alleys to mass graves, songs to choking dust. He'd won the war, and somehow lost the appetite for being the man who won it. Around him, soldiers tried on the borrowed emotions of winners' laughs too loud, wine too fast. Others sat with their hands curled like claws, staring at nothing. Trauma doesn't wait for you to get home. It unpacks itself right there on the battlefield and asks where you keep the spare sheets. Odysseus took in their faces and felt the old iron weight of command on his chest. These men wanted a line on a map and a promise home. He could point to Ithaca all night long, but maps are polite lies. The sea writes in corrections. Up on Olympus, the gallery doors were open. Hera's voice was calm in that way. A storm is calm before it hits the coast. Athena tilted the scales in her hand and said nothing wise people often do, and beneath everything, in the long dark halls under the world, something in the salt woke when Polyphemus's name flickered across tomorrow's thread. Poseidon keeps grudges the way mountains keep snow stubbornly, and for a long time, Odysseus couldn't hear the gods, but he felt the draft from the door. He thought of Penelope weaving by lamplight patient, dangerous patience, and of Telemachus, a boy aging in the shadow of a father-shaped outline. In that house, men with big appetites and small morals were settling in, calling themselves guests. Ithaca wasn't a postcard waiting on a mantle. It was a room filling with wolves. The thought did not comfort him. It sharpened him. He didn't say any of that out loud. He issued simple orders, instead supplies. Water. Bind the wounds. We sail at dawn. Leaders get to break inside only when there's no one around to notice. When he was finally alone on a half-buried step, he let his hands shake. He didn't pray to Zeus. He didn't flatter Hera. He looked down at the ash lodged in the lines of his palms and said, almost conversationally, "Let me go home." Olympus customer support did not respond. A cracked lyre plucked a few stubborn notes somewhere behind him. A man laughed, then coughed, then didn't. The sea wind pulled the smoke sideways and left behind the iron smell of blood warming and cooling in cycles. Odysseus closed his eyes and let the noise blur. If you've ever sat in the dark after a long, ugly day and realized the victory you wanted doesn't feel like victory, he was there. Exactly there. Most retellings cut here and fast forward to monsters. We're not skipping the bill. This is where the interest starts accruing, compound. He rose before dawn. The horizon wore a thin red edge like a knife just about to show you what it's for. Men limped to the waterline, carrying stolen goods and heavier ghosts. The ships bobbed in the shallows black, purposeful, a little like coffins that hadn't decided who belonged in them yet. Odysseus walked the length of the lead vessel with a hand on the rails. He checked knots, counted heads, stared down at his reflection until the ripples made a stranger of him. He did not look back at Troy. Turning around wouldn't put a single brick back on another. Besides, there's a superstition among sailors about letting the past see your face too long. It learns your features and follows you home. Row easy, he said, and the oars went in. The ship moved like a thought sliding across a mind that had already decided. Behind him, ash. In front of him, a syllabus the gods had put together with real school bully energy. He watched the coast fall away, watched gulls peel off and return to their business, watched the horizon go from arm's length to impossible. He steadied the tiller and found that old rhythm, the one a good captain keeps eyes on the weather, ear on the men, mind on the math of distance and food. You could almost convince yourself this was just a trip. You could almost forget that somewhere under all this blue, a god with a long memory and a short fuse was listening for your name. In Ithaca, under the same morning light, Penelope set her shuttle down and listened too. The house creaked in a way it never had when Odysseus was there, like the beams missed who they were supposed to hold up. Telemachus asked a question no one could answer without lying. When is he coming home? A mother's answer is a kind of shield. Penelope raised hers with a steady hand and went back to the loom that doubled as armour. Back at sea, a gust shouldered the sail, and the ship leaned into it like a tired man into a good chair. Odysseus felt the boat's hum in his bones. He let himself imagine the first view of Ithaca grey-green hills, the hard glitter of olive leaves, a shoreline that meets you like an old friend who still remembers your worst story and loves you anyway. He didn't know about the lotus waiting, or the cave with a door only a giant could move, or the song you survive by being tied to something stronger than yourself. If he had, he might have turned the ship around. No, he wouldn't. But he might have taken a deeper breath. Keep her steady, he told the helmsman, and the man nodded without looking up. The crew fell quiet into that working silence sailors trust. Odysseus counted the beat of the oars and tried to count something else. The number of mistakes a man is allowed before the gods stop calling them lessons. The sun climbed. The coastline faded to rumour. The water went a darker kind of blue, like a bruise resolving. Birds disappeared. The world simplified ropes, wood, wind, will. Standing there with his cloak pulled tight and the taste of smoke still in his throat, Odysseus understood a hard truth he'd spend the next 20 years proving winning a war is logistics. Going home is theology. He gripped the tiller, the ship answered. The sea remained undecided. And somewhere deep below, a voice that sounded like boulders learning how to speak exhaled through the miles of water between a god and a man. It didn't say not yet. It didn't have to. Next the shoreline that looks like mercy, the fruit that tastes like forgetting, and the first time Odysseus learns that survival isn't the same thing as returning. Far across the sea, under the same stretch of sky, a different kind of battle was happening. The sun had only just climbed over Ithaca, painting the rough hills in pale gold, but the great hall already echoed with voices that didn't belong. Men lounged where they hadn't earned the right, draped in Odysseus's chairs, drinking his wine as if they had planted the vines themselves. Laughter spilled out into the courtyard too loud, too sure. It was the sound of people convinced no one was coming back to stop them. Penelope moved through that noise like a ghost that refused to leave her own house. She wore a shawl, frayed at the edges from restless fingers, and her hair was tied back with the kind of care that made it look effortless. For 20 years she'd kept the wolves at bay with nothing but patience and a loom. Each night she unravelled the day's weaving, buying herself time. Time for a husband who might already be dead. Time for a son who was growing up too fast. Telemachus watched her from the threshold. He was tall for his age, but carried himself like a boy who knew the walls were closing in. He remembered his father only as a story, a shadow flickering on the walls when the hearth fire burned low. That memory wasn't enough to keep 50 greedy men from circling his mother like dogs. He could either wait for a ghost to save them, or step into the storm himself. Eurymachus, one of the suitors with a smile that never reached his eyes, raised a cup toward Telemachus. "Come join us, boy. Drink to your father's health or his grave. Does it matter which any more?" The hall erupted in laughter. Telemachus's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to throw them out, every last one. He wanted to shout that his father was alive, that Odysseus could outwit gods and kings. But saying it wouldn't make it true. Not yet. That night, as the suitors stumbled into their beds, Penelope sat alone at the loom. The moonlight turned the thread silver. Telemachus sat beside her, silent for a long time. Finally he said, "Mother, what if he's never coming back?" His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the boy still inside him. Penelope's shuttle stilled. She didn't turn to him right away. When she did, her face held that calm you only learn from years of waiting. "Then we keep going," she said. "But until I know for sure, I will keep weaving, and you will keep your head high." It wasn't a promise, but it was the kind of answer that kept the walls from collapsing. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of the sea. Telemachus felt it like a whisper. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. The next morning he stood on the cliffs, looking out over the restless water. He imagined a black-sailed ship cutting across that horizon. He imagined a man at the tiller, smoke still in his lungs, eyes fixed on home. He didn't know if that man was alive. He only knew he had to find out. A plan began to take shape, fragile, dangerous, necessary. If the gods wouldn't send Odysseus home, Telemachus would go looking. He'd find word in Pylos, or Sparta, or anywhere that sailors still whispered stories of Troy. The thought terrified him, but so did the idea of doing nothing while his mother's life was eaten away one feast at a time. He didn't tell Penelope yet. The weight of it sat between his ribs like a secret flame. In the palace, the suitors were already awake, shouting for meat, for more wine, for Penelope's hand as if she were a prize at the end of a rigged game. Telemachus walked past them, head high, jaw tight. He didn't rise to their jeers. Not today. He had other storms to navigate. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be his father's son, not the strength of arms, but the strength to endure humiliation and still keep moving. That night he lay awake listening to the crash of waves against the cliffs. He wondered if his father heard the same sea. He wondered if somewhere out there a prayer had been answered, or if the gods were still laughing in their golden halls. He promised himself something in the dark if Odysseus lived. He'd find him, and if he didn't, then Ithaca would learn to fear the boy they'd underestimated. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Penelope stirred in her chamber. The loom stood silent, threads half woven, half unravelled. Far off, thunder grumbled where no storm yet showed. The sea was shifting. So were the hearts of mortals. And on a distant ship, a man who had stopped believing in omens lifted his head, as if he'd heard his son's vow carried on the wind. The Odyssey is not only a tale of monsters and gods. It's about two people staring at the same moon from different shores, daring to hope. And that hope, fragile as a thread on a loom, is about to be tested. Next comes the easy part, sailing into a world designed to break you. The hard part, not breaking. Dawn came sharp and red, as if the sky itself remembered the fires of Troy. Odysseus stood at the prow of his ship, the salt wind cutting through the smoke still clinging to his hair. The fleet creaked and stirred behind him, a ragged convoy of men who'd survived a decade of war but still looked over their shoulders, half expecting an arrow out of the dark. They weren't wrong to be jumpy. The gods have long memories, and men make easy sport. By midday the sails were full. Ithaca somewhere over the curve of the world, but homecoming is never a straight line. They saw the coast of Ismarus first, its hills green and tempting, a city fat with goods, and unprepared for the wolves at its door. Some captains argued to keep going. Odysseus hesitated. His men were tired, bleeding, and hungry. Here was food, wine, coin, a chance to feel like victors before the sea swallowed them again. Sometimes the worst mistakes wear the mask of mercy. They struck fast. The Ciconians never had a chance. Smoke rose from their huts before evening. Sheep bellowed as they were driven to the ships. Amphorae of wine clinked like trophies. Odysseus warned them not to linger. "Take what we need and go," he said. But victory is an intoxicant, and his men were drunk on it long before they uncorked the first jar. They feasted on the beach, singing war songs out of tune, piling treasure as if the gods wouldn't notice. At dawn the Ciconians answered. Reinforcements poured from the hills, chariots rattling, spears like a field of death. The counterattack hit like a hammer. Men who had fought through Troy fell screaming in the surf. The same ships that brought them here became their coffins. Odysseus fought to hold the line, eyes burning, heart a fist of guilt. He had told them to leave. He hadn't made them listen. By the time the fleet limped back to sea, 6 men from every ship were gone. The survivors rowed in silence. No songs now. Just the slap of oars and the occasional sob a man tried to swallow. The wine tasted like ash. The gold weighed like lead. Odysseus sat apart, staring at his hands. Leadership is a cruel tutor. It never lets you forget whose lives were the tuition. This wasn't the god's curse. Not yet. This was just human folly, and it would not be the last. Out beyond the breakers, the wind began to shift. Dark clouds bunched like fists on the horizon. The sea has a way of sniffing out weakness. It rolls in when you're least ready. Odysseus ordered the sails reefed, the lines checked. He felt the first cool drops of rain on his face and wondered if it was just weather or an omen. When you've angered as many deities as he had, it's hard to tell the difference. That night the storm broke. Lightning split the sky wide open. Thunder chased itself across the waves. The ships scattered, blind in the blackness, men bailing water with their bare hands. Somewhere in that chaos Odysseus thought of Penelope, of Telemachus watching the same storm from his cliff, and swore through gritted teeth that he would see them again. Salt stung his eyes, or maybe it was tears. The sea doesn't differentiate. By dawn the storm had spent itself, leaving the fleet battered but alive. They counted losses, more gear gone, more men missing. Odysseus tasted the bitterness of another near disaster, and felt a lesson hardening inside him. The road home would demand more than courage. It would demand restraint, wisdom, and a willingness to leave the spoils behind on Ithaca's shore. Penelope's loom clicked in the quiet of morning. Telemachus woke from a dream of ships and thunder. Far across the water, his father gripped the tiller and promised himself, and the gods listening in their golden halls, that he'd get it right next time. Whether they'd let him is another matter. And over the horizon waited islands with sweeter traps than gold, where forgetting could feel like peace, and peace could mean never going home. Days blurred into a rhythm of salt and silence. The sea stretched in every direction, a restless blue plain, and the men rowed because there was nothing else to do. They avoided each other's eyes. Loss makes people quiet, and the ghost from Ismarus rode with them on every wave. Odysseus kept his hand on the tiller and his mind on Ithaca. But the sea doesn't reward straight lines. It rewards detours and illusions. One evening, the horizon bloomed green. Low islands, lush and inviting, rose out of the water like a mirage. The men sat up, pointed, murmured prayers to any god who might be listening. Their lips were cracked, their arms like lead from the oars. An island meant shade, water, food, rest. They beached the ships at dawn. The air smelled different here, sweet, almost floral. Rolling hills were covered in strange plants, leaves shining as if polished, flowers pale gold in the morning light. There were people too, but they didn't run or fight. They smiled, slow and dreamy, and offered fruit in baskets woven from reeds. It didn't look dangerous. That's what made it dangerous. Odysseus hung back. Years of war had taught him that free gifts often come with invisible strings, but his men were starving for more than food. They took the fruit round pods of something like figs, something like honey. The first bite made their shoulders drop. The second made them forget how tired they were. By the third, they were laughing like children, stretched out under the sun, eyes half-lidded with bliss. The locals' lotus eaters, as sailors later called them, sat nearby, chewing lazily, humming soft songs that rose and fell with the breeze. One of them offered Odysseus a piece of the fruit. He almost refused, almost, but curiosity is a stubborn itch. He brought it to his lips, breathed it in, sweet, earthy, with an edge of something that reminded him of sleep. He didn't bite. A captain can't afford to forget. And there was something in his men's laughter that made his skin crawl. He called to them, told them it was time to go. No one moved. A few blinked, slow and content. One said, "Go where why?" The question chilled him. These were men who had survived 10 years of blood and bronze. Now they were lying in the sand like they'd never left their mother's hearths. Odysseus dropped the fruit, tasted bile. He knew the signs of a trap when he saw one. Not a trap of swords and spears, a trap of comfort. He walked among them, shaking shoulders, cursing, begging. Some wept when he dragged them up. Others clung to the fruit, clutching it like treasure. They had forgotten Ithaca, forgotten Penelope, forgotten why they'd ever left Troy. If you've ever lost yourself in something meant to numb you, drink. Endless scrolling. Anything that makes the hours vanish, you know the look in their eyes. The Odyssey isn't just about monsters with teeth. Sometimes the monster is the part of you that wants to give up. By sheer force of will and a few well-placed threats, Odysseus and the few still clear-headed hauled the enchanted dreamers back to the ships. They tied them to benches like madmen, loaded the hulls with water, and shoved off before the island could swallow anyone else. The lotus eaters watched from the shore, still smiling, still chewing, their songs carried out to sea. No anger, no chase, just a terrifying indifference, as if the whole world could vanish and they wouldn't care. When the island was a green smudge on the horizon, Odysseus finally sat, chest heaving. He looked at his men, some still crying for the fruit. He thought about how close he'd come to tasting it himself. What if he had? What if he'd forgotten Ithaca, Penelope, Telemachus? Maybe that was the point. Peace without purpose is just another kind of death. That night, under a canopy of stars, he didn't sleep. He watched the water and wondered what other traps waited. The gods didn't need to send storms or hurl bolts to break a man. They just had to offer him what he thought he wanted. On the distant cliffs of Ithaca, Penelope sat at her loom. Telemachus dreamed of ships again, and far out on the wine-dark sea. Odysseus tightened his grip on the tiller. More certain than ever, home wasn't just a place. It was a fight. And he wasn't done fighting. The sea stayed calm for days, a flat mirror under a pale sky. But Odysseus didn't trust it. Calm seas make you think the worst is behind you. They make you forget the gods are still watching. The men rowed with a steadier rhythm now, though some still shook when they dreamed of the lotus fields. They needed a win, something simple: food, water, maybe a roof for a night. When they spotted the rocky island with its plume of cooking smoke, relief rolled through the crew like wine. The place looked wild but promising: green slopes, caves in the cliffs, goats leaping like ghosts across the ridges. They found a stream of cold water and plenty of fat goats to catch. For a brief moment, life felt manageable again. They built fires, roasted meat, laughed with mouths full. That's when Odysseus made the choice that would define the next decade of his life. Off the shore lay another, larger island. From it carried the faint bleating of more goats and the smell of wood smoke far richer than anything their camp had made. Odysseus's curiosity, always a blessing and a curse, stirred. "There's someone over there," he said. "A host, maybe. Someone with cheese, wine, stories, a gift for guests." His men shifted uneasily. They had food, they had water, they had no need to gamble. But Odysseus was Odysseus, and pride has a way of sounding like reason when you've been lucky this long. They rowed a small party over the narrow strait, carrying a skin of their own wine to trade. The island was quiet, no villages, no herdsmen in sight, just a massive cave with pens outside and piles of cheese curing on stone slabs. Inside, the air was cool and thick with the smell of milk and animal. "Take what we need and go," one man whispered. Odysseus shook his head. "We'll wait for the host. It's only right." They didn't have to wait long. The ground trembled. A shadow blotted out the sun at the cave mouth. And then he ducked inside a giant the size of a small barn, a single eye glaring from the middle of his forehead. His shoulders brushed the cave walls. His hands could snap a man like a wishbone. This was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, and he wasn't interested in hosting. He dropped an armload of wood, drove his ewes into the pen, and only then noticed the strangers. The look on his face wasn't surprise, it was hunger. Greeks, he rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding under the tide. More meat. The men froze. Odysseus stepped forward, words smooth as polished stone. We are travellers, blown off course. We ask for hospitality, as the gods decree. We bring you wine. He held out the skin. The Cyclops just laughed. The gods, my father is a god, and his rules are not mine. Before anyone could move, Polyphemus reached down, snatched 2 men and dashed them against the cave floor. The sound was wet and final. Then he ate them, tearing flesh from bone while the others screamed. Night fell with the smell of blood in the air. Polyphemus rolled an enormous boulder across the entrance, sealing them inside like flies in a jar. There are monsters you can fight with swords, and then there are monsters who don't even notice your blade. Odysseus's mind raced. They couldn't move the stone, even 100 men couldn't. Killing the Cyclops outright would trap them forever. They needed a plan that bordered on madness. As Polyphemus slept, snoring like a landslide, Odysseus stared into the dark and thought about what it would take to turn a nightmare into an opportunity. By morning, the Cyclops had eaten 2 more men. The survivors huddled near the back of the cave, praying to gods they weren't sure were listening. Odysseus whispered his scheme a sharpened stake. The strong wine as bait, a fake name, nobody that might buy them a sliver of hope. It was a dangerous idea, reckless even, but it was the only thing between them and oblivion. That night, as Polyphemus drank himself into a stupor on Odysseus's potent wine, the crew heated the stake in the embers until it glowed. The Cyclops laughed, belched, and promised to eat nobody last. Odysseus gave the signal. Together they drove the blazing point into that single eye. The roar shook the island. The smell of burning flesh filled the cave. Polyphemus thrashed, boulder still in place, screaming for his brothers. Nobody has blinded me. And so, when the other Cyclops called back, all they heard was nonsense. Nobody hurt him. Nobody did it. As dawn broke, Polyphemus rolled the stone aside to let his flock out, crouching at the entrance to feel for escaping men. Odysseus had thought ahead. Each survivor clung to the underside of a sheep, gripping wool while the blinded giant patted harmless backs. One by one, they slipped out into the grey morning, hearts hammering louder than the surf. They rode like men possessed, the shore receding, the nightmare shrinking behind them. Relief surged, and with it, Odysseus's fatal flaw. He couldn't resist taunting the wounded giant, shouting his real name across the water. Pride tastes sweet in the moment. Later, it turns bitter, on the rocks. Polyphemus raised his hands to the sky and screamed a curse to his father. Poseidon, grant that Odysseus never reaches home. Or if he does, let him come late, alone, a broken man to a house of trouble. The waves answered, rising higher. Odysseus felt the first true weight of a god's anger then, a chill deeper than salt water. The journey home had just become personal for him, and for the sea god who now knew his name. The sea carried them away from the Cyclops' island, but there was no real escape. Every man on that boat felt the curse like an invisible hand pressing on his chest. They rowed harder than they ever had, as if speed alone could outrun a god's anger. The waves slapped against the hull in uneven rhythms, a warning more than a lullaby. Odysseus kept his face forward, jaw tight. He'd been proud, and his pride had bought them Poseidon's wrath. Still, there was no time to dwell. Survival doesn't wait for guilt to finish its speech. For a few blessed days, the winds favoured them. They rounded headlands, skirted jagged coasts, and by some mercy of the fates found themselves in calmer waters. It felt almost normal again. At night the stars burned bright and close, the kind of sky that makes you believe someone might be listening when you whisper into the dark. And yet, every time the wind died, even for a moment, the men glanced at each other with the same unspoken fear the Cyclops' prayer was only beginning to take root. While Odysseus pushed forward, a different struggle brewed back in Ithaca. In the great hall, the suitors had grown bolder, word of Troy's fall had spread, and with it the assumption that its victors had either settled elsewhere or died on the way home. Penelope moved among the tables with a practiced calm, her face unreadable. Inside, her thoughts were a different storm. She'd bought herself years with the loom trick, weaving by day and unravelling by night, but eyes were on her constantly now. Eurymachus whispered lies about Odysseus to weaken her resolve. Antinous mocked Telemachus openly, daring him to speak up. The boy's hands shook with rage he didn't know how to hide. That evening, Telemachus sat on the same cliffs where he had once watched the horizon. The sun bled orange into the sea, and he felt small beneath the weight of it. He remembered his mother's words, "Keep your head high." But how long could you hold your head high while jackals feasted in your house? He thought of his father, not the myth the suitors mocked, but the man he'd never really met. Was Odysseus alive? Would he ever walk through their door again? Sometimes waiting feels worse than death. At least death gives you an answer. Athena had been watching. Disguised as a stranger, she came to the boy at night, her voice low and steady. She urged him to act, not to sink into despair. "Go," she whispered. "Seek news of your father. Sail to Pylos, to Sparta. Hear the truth from those who fought beside him. Whether he lives or not, you must become more than a shadow." Telemachus didn't know if this was a dream or a visitation, but it planted a fire in his chest. The next morning, as Odysseus's battered ship cut across open water half a world away, Telemachus made a vow. He would gather a crew, small and discreet, and search the wide sea for any trace of his father. He didn't tell Penelope yet. Her burden was already heavier than anyone deserved. But that night, as the suitors laughed too loud over stolen wine, he caught his mother's eye across the hall. Something passed between them, quiet understanding, stubborn hope. Back on the water, Odysseus guided his men into unknown channels. The coastline ahead bristled with strange rocks, the kind that makes sailors whisper about shipwrecks even under a full moon. He studied the sky, the tide, the faces of his men. They were exhausted, wounded, and yet still willing to follow. That loyalty cut deeper than any blade. He couldn't let Poseidon's curse have the final word. The moon rose, fat and gold, painting a path across the waves. Odysseus tightened his grip on the tiller. Somewhere behind him, a god seethed. Somewhere ahead, his son was learning to fight in his own way. Neither knew how close their fates would weave together. The night air carried a promise and a threat. The easy parts of this story were over. By dawn, the sea would test them again, and so would the gods. The next stretch of sea felt like a gift they hadn't earned. A steady breeze carried them west, and for once no black storm clouds bunched on the horizon. The men began to whisper that maybe the curse was fading, that maybe the gods had finally grown bored of punishing them. Odysseus didn't share their optimism. He'd been around long enough to know a gift can hide a hook. They saw Aeolia at sunrise, an island ringed with high bronze walls that shone like fire in the dawn light. Strange banners fluttered from its towers, and the air carried a faint hum, as if the wind itself was alive there. Odysseus ordered the ship ashore. Whatever awaited, they needed supplies, and if fortune was kind, some friendly face among strangers. Aeolus, master of the winds, met them himself. He wasn't a towering god like Zeus or Poseidon. He looked more like a clever chieftain, a man with eyes always on the horizon. He welcomed them into his hall, fed them roasted meats and honeyed wine, and asked about their journey. When Odysseus spoke of Troy, of storms and curses, Aeolus listened without judgment. Then he made an offer no sailor in his right mind could refuse. "I'll give you the wind itself," Aeolus said, "but only if you have the wisdom to use it." He presented Odysseus with a leather bag bound in silver. Inside, Aeolus had tied up all the adverse winds, every gust that could push them off course. "The west wind alone will guide you home," Aeolus explained. "Guard this well. Do not open it until you reach Ithaca." Odysseus accepted with gratitude, bowing low. For 9 blessed days after they left Aeolia, the bag worked its magic. The sea was calm, the wind steady. So close were they that the hills of Ithaca began to show faintly on the horizon. Home was within reach. That's when old temptations crept in. While Odysseus, exhausted, slept at the stern, whispers slithered among the crew. What was in the bag? Gold, silver. Some secret treasure their captain meant to keep for himself. They remembered the loot taken at Ismarus. The treasures split unevenly. Suspicion is a disease. It spreads fastest in silence. A few hours from home, they made the mistake that would cost them years. Under a moonless sky, while Odysseus dreamed of Penelope's loom and Telemachus's face, the crew untied the silver cords. The moment the bag split open, the world exploded. All the winds Aeolus had trapped screamed out in fury. The ship lurched. Masts groaned. The west wind vanished under a gale that tossed them like driftwood. Odysseus woke to chaos, grabbing the tiller as men howled apologies too late to matter. By dawn, Ithaca was gone. A cruel memory over the horizon. The storm dragged them all the way back to Aeolia's gates. Soaked and shaking, Odysseus climbed the bronze steps and begged Aeolus for help once more. But the master of winds shook his head. "The gods clearly hate you," he said flatly, "and I won't cross them. Get off my island." Rejection hit harder than the storm. Odysseus returned to his ship, staring at the men who'd undone everything. There was no rage in his eyes, just a hollow exhaustion. They rowed back into the open sea, hungry and humiliated. Above them, the sky was mercilessly clear. Sometimes that's worse than thunder. Far away on Ithaca's cliffs, Telemachus woke to another day of jeers and whispers. He didn't know how close his father had come. Odysseus didn't know how far he still had to go. The sea between them stretched wider than ever, and Poseidon wasn't finished playing with his prey. They rowed for days, the sun beating down like a curse, until land appeared again. At first it seemed a blessing high cliffs, smoke curling from unseen hearths, the smell of pine and something cooking drifting across the water. The men's stomachs knotted with hunger. After the disaster with Aeolus's gift, they needed a break, a safe harbour. But Odysseus had learned to be wary of easy answers. He kept most of the fleet offshore while he took one ship in to scout. The bay was wide and eerily quiet. No fishermen, no herds, just a ring of cliffs that seemed to lean inward like listening giants. The water was so clear they could see fish flashing below the hull. It looked peaceful, too peaceful. Safe harbours are where the worst storms like to hide. They found a small cove with a spring and decided to camp for the night. Fires crackled. The men relaxed, lulled by the sound of waves against stone. At dawn, Odysseus sent a party inland to find the locals and trade. The scouting crew didn't return. The waiting men shifted uneasily, fingers tightening around spear shafts. Then the hillside above them darkened. They came out of nowhere, giants as tall as city walls, with arms like tree trunks and voices like thunder. Lestrygonians. Their king hurled the first spear, a trunk stripped of bark. It punched through a man and the deck behind him. The others followed, boulders flying, shattering hulls as if they were toys. Men screamed, ships splintered. Some were plucked from the decks and bitten in half before they could even draw a blade. The clear bay turned red. Odysseus bellowed for his men to cut the mooring lines. His ship, farther out in the bay, had a narrow chance. The rest of the fleet was trapped against the cliffs. No room to manoeuvre. One by one, the giants smashed them to pieces. Spears rained down, pinning men to timbers. The air was full of the sickening mix of salt, smoke, and blood. Odysseus's helmsmen shoved their ship into open water. They rowed like men possessed while the giants roared from shore, hurling rocks that sent up walls of spray around them. A boulder the size of a house missed their stern by inches. The survivors didn't look back. Looking back meant seeing brothers die, and they couldn't afford that weight not yet. After Troy, after the Cyclops, you'd think they'd seen enough horror. But the sea always has another nightmare ready. By nightfall, only Odysseus's ship remained. Every other vessel was gone, every other crew devoured or crushed. The men sat slumped over their oars, faces grey with shock. Odysseus moved among them quietly, binding wounds, offering what words he could. Inside, his thoughts were a storm. Pride had cost them once. Ignorance had cost them again. How many more would he lose before Ithaca, the stars came out? Cold and bright, indifferent to the carnage below. The sea rocked them gently now, as if mocking the violence of the day. Odysseus stood at the prow, staring into the dark horizon. Somewhere ahead lay more trials, more tests dreamt up by gods with long memories. Behind him floated the wreckage of friends and years. He swore silently that their deaths would not be meaningless. He would learn, he would endure, and if the gods wanted to break him, they'd have to try harder. The knights swallowed the oath, carrying it toward whatever waited on the next island: a witch, a prophecy, and a road that led through the land of the dead. They drifted for days, hollowed out by what they'd seen at the Laestrygonian Bay. The sea felt too big now, every horizon a threat. Only one ship remained, and even it carried more ghosts than men. Hunger gnawed, and silence sat heavy on their shoulders. When the wind finally pushed them toward another island, it looked almost too good to be real. Rolling green hills, smoke curling from somewhere inland, and the faint smell of roasting meat carried on the breeze. Odysseus didn't trust it, not after what they'd lost. But his men were gaunt, their hands shaking on the oars. They needed rest, food, something to remind them life could still be gentle. They beached the ship in a quiet cove and followed a trail inland, hearts thudding with a mix of hope and dread. The island felt strange, as if it were watching them. Birds sang, but the songs were off-key. The trees bent slightly toward a single sprawling house at the center of a clearing. A safe roof can be more dangerous than an open sea. The house belonged to Circe, though they didn't know her name yet. From the outside it looked warm and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney, the smell of bread and herbs drifting on the air. Pigs grunted in pens nearby, dozens of them, oddly silent when they looked at the strangers. The front door opened before they could knock. A woman stood there, beautiful in a way that made the men's thoughts stumble. Her voice was warm honey as she beckoned them inside. Food, drink. "You look half dead," she said. "Come, be my guests." After years of war and months of misery, it was too much temptation. The first group went in willingly. Odysseus hung back, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He waited outside with a handful of men scanning the edge of the woods. Time stretched. Laughter floated from inside, then went eerily quiet. When one man finally ran out, his face was white as bone. He stammered that Circe had given them wine and a feast, and when they'd eaten, she touched them with her wand. Their voices had turned to squeals. Their bodies had shrunk. They were pigs now. Those silent hogs in the pen weren't livestock. They were his crewmates. The men with Odysseus panicked, some ready to rush in and fight. Odysseus held them back. Charging blind had cost them too much already. He gripped his sword, heart hammering, and did what he always did, thought his way through. But even his cleverness had limits. How do you fight a witch whose words twist the world? Sometimes the only way forward is through someone else's mercy. As Odysseus stood on the path, torn between rage and fear, a figure appeared from the trees, tall, cloaked, with the kind of stillness that makes you pay attention. It was Hermes, god of travellers, and he held out a small sprig of a plant with white flowers. "Eat this first," Hermes said quietly. "It will shield you from her spell. Then face her. Use her rules against her." Odysseus took the plant, its bitter taste grounding him. With his sword drawn, he walked straight through Circe's door. The witch smiled as if expecting another victim. She raised her wand, her words curled like smoke. Nothing happened. Odysseus lunged, blade to her throat. "Change them back," he said, his voice flat steel. To his surprise, she laughed. "Bold," she said, "maybe even worthy." With a flick of her wrist, the pigs became men again, stumbling, dazed, human. No blood spilled. Instead of killing him, Circe invited Odysseus to sit. He did, sword still close. That night, a strange truce began, part danger, part kindness. They would stay on this island far longer than planned. For the first time in months, there would be soft beds and real food, but the price of comfort was never free. Outside, the pigs' now men huddled under the stars, unsure whether they'd escaped a curse or stepped into a deeper one. The line between salvation and ruin had never been thinner, and the gods, as always, were watching. Days on Circe's island blurred in a way the open sea never could. The men slept on soft beds for the first time in years, their bellies full, their wounds bandaged. It felt like a spell even before you remembered there actually was one. Circe moved among them with a calm that could have been kindness or calculation. With her, It was always hard to tell. She laughed easily, offered advice unasked, and sometimes looked at Odysseus as if she knew exactly how far he still had to fall. He stayed wary, but even Odysseus wasn't made of stone. Her hall was warm, the air heavy with roasted meat and sweet wine, and the fear of losing more men softened under that comfort. A month passed before he even realized it, when Eurylochus, his second, finally muttered that they couldn't stay forever. Odysseus felt a stab of shame. Ithaca was still out there, waiting. Penelope still weaving. Telemachus still growing up without him. Comfort can be its own kind of prison. Leaving a witch's bed is harder than storming a city's walls. When Odysseus finally told Circe they had to leave, she didn't rage. She only nodded, as if she'd been expecting it all along. "You won't find your way home by sailing blind," she said. "The path you need runs through shadow. You must visit the dead." Her words hit like cold water. To find his way home, he had to travel to the underworld itself, speak to the prophet Tiresias among the shades. The men were terrified when they heard. After Cyclops, after giants, after becoming pigs, the idea of stepping into the land of the dead felt like a final insult from the gods. Some whispered of mutiny. Others begged Circe to keep them. Odysseus held the line. "We didn't come this far to turn back now," he said, though his own voice shook. He'd buried friends before. The thought of seeing their shades again made his stomach twist. Circe gave them detailed instructions where to sail, how to dig the trench, the libations to offer milk, honey, wine, water, and blood. "Do exactly as I say," she warned, "and whatever you do, don't let fear drive you from that place before Tiresias speaks. The dead can smell fear, and worse." Her words hung in the air long after she left. That evening Odysseus stood outside her hall, staring at the horizon. The sky burned purple and red, the kind of sunset that feels like an omen. He thought of his mother, of the comrades he'd left on foreign soil. He wondered if they waited among the shades, if they blamed him. The sea had always been dangerous, but the thought of that black river and its voiceless crowd chilled him deeper than any storm. The Odyssey isn't just a journey across water, it's a journey through everything you'd rather avoid. At dawn, Circe gave them her final gift: fresh provisions, a following wind, and her unflinching gaze as they pushed the ship back into the surf. "Remember," she called over the waves, "the path home runs through death first." The men pulled at the oars in silence. Behind them, Circe's island faded to a green smear. Ahead, the water stretched darker than before, as if it already knew where they were headed. Odysseus stayed at the prow, the salt air sharp in his lungs. He didn't pray. The gods had done enough already. Instead, he promised himself one thing. He would look Tiresias in the eye, take whatever truth waited among the dead, and keep moving, even if it broke him, especially if it broke him. By nightfall, the sky was a vault of black, and the stars looked like watching eyes. The men huddled on deck, whispering of ghosts and rivers of fire. Odysseus let them talk. Fear was honest. It meant they still cared about living. The real danger was when men stopped being afraid. That's when they stopped fighting. Somewhere beyond that horizon was the edge of the living world. Beyond it, a dark shore where no bird sang and no wind blew. Odysseus closed his eyes against the night, thinking of Penelope's lamp glowing in the hall, Telemachus's unsteady hands on a ship's tiller. The living waited, but first, the dead. The sea grew colder as they sailed north, the air heavy and still. Even the gulls stopped following. No life seemed to move this way. The men pulled their cloaks tight, their breath misting as dawn broke grey and weak. Odysseus said little. He stood at the prow, eyes fixed on the dark line ahead. This wasn't any land they knew. It felt like the world's edge. By the time the sun dipped again, they reached a place where the waves slowed, as if reluctant to touch the shore. The beach was black gravel, sharp underfoot, and the cliffs behind rose like broken teeth. There was no wind. The silence itself felt alive. The men shivered, not from the cold, but from the sense that someone or something was already waiting. It takes courage to fight monsters you can see. It takes more to face the ghosts you've been avoiding. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus led them inland to a low, desolate plain where a thin mist clung to the earth. There he drew his sword and marked a trench. They poured the libations as told honey mixed with milk, sweet wine, water, scattering barley over it all, and then, the hardest part, he cut the throats of the black sheep Circe had given them. The warm blood filled the trench, steam curling into the cold air. At first there was nothing, then the mist thickened. Shadows began to gather, wavering shapes drawn by the scent of blood. The men stumbled back, eyes wide. Odysseus forced himself to stand firm, holding his blade across the trench. He had to keep the shades at bay until Tiresias came. The dead pressed close, whispering in voices like rustling leaves. Their faces flickered in the half-light, familiar and strange. He saw warriors from Troy, their eyes still bright with old rage. He saw nameless sailors, mouths open in soundless pleas, and then, one face cut him deeper than any spear could. His mother, Anticlea. She'd been alive when he sailed to Troy. Now she stood among the dead, pale and hollow-eyed. Odysseus almost broke then. His sword wavered. Every instinct screamed to cross that trench, to reach for her. But he remembered Circe's warning Tiresias first. Answers before grief. Sometimes the gods demand you reopen wounds just to get home. The prophet finally came, tall and blind, leaning on his staff. His shade looked heavier than the others, as if even death hadn't lightened his burden. He bent to the blood and drank. Only then could he speak. His voice was steady, the words cutting like cold iron. He told Odysseus what he already feared Poseidon's curse would not break easily. "You will suffer more," Tiresias said. "But if you and your men can resist the cattle of the sun god, you may yet reach Ithaca. Fail, and ruin will follow you home." He spoke of Scylla and Charybdis, of sirens whose song was a knife wrapped in honey. He spoke of a house full of enemies, men eating and drinking what was not theirs. "Even if you reach Ithaca," Tiresias warned, "you will find blood waiting." Each word was a weight on Odysseus's chest, but he took them all. Better the hard truth than the silence of not knowing. When Tiresias finished, Odysseus begged him for more. How had his mother died? What waited beyond these shores? The prophet answered what he could, then faded back into the mist. Only then did Odysseus allow his mother close. She drank and spoke softly, telling him she died of grief, not war, that Penelope still waited. Her voice cracked when she spoke of Telemachus, a boy becoming a man too soon. The men wept openly. They were sailors and fighters, but here in the shadow of death, they were just sons and brothers. The dead pressed closer, more voices rising, friends, foes, forgotten faces. The air grew heavy with longing and dread. Odysseus felt the pull to stay, to listen forever. But the living don't belong among the dead. He raised his sword and drove them back, heart splitting with every step toward the ship. The shades receded, the mist thinning. By the time they reached the black shore, the wind had returned, whispering across the waves. They pushed off, silent, each man carrying new scars no one could see. As the land of the dead shrank behind them, Odysseus gripped the tiller. The prophecy sat in his gut like a stone. The path ahead would be worse than anything so far, and yet, for the first time in years, he knew the way. The sea waited, patient and merciless. The sea felt heavier after they left the shadow of that black shore, as if the ghosts had slipped into the hull and refused to let go. The men rowed in silence, their faces drawn, each of them haunted by the voices they'd heard. Odysseus stood at the prow, scanning the horizon, the prophecy replaying in his head like a warning drum. Scylla, Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, and beyond all that, a house that might kill him even if the sea didn't. They returned to Circe's island briefly, just as she'd told them to. Her hall smelled of the same warm bread, her face unreadable when Odysseus recounted what Tiresias had said. She didn't comfort him. That wasn't her way. Instead, she gave him the details Tiresias had only hinted at: the route past the sirens, the rocks where Scylla waited, the whirlpool that could swallow a ship whole. "You can't fight her," Circe said of Scylla. "Pick 6 men you can bear to lose, or lose everything. That's the choice. A leader's burden isn't making the right choice. It's living with the wrong ones you have to make." The men listened with growing dread. They'd seen enough to believe every word. When Circe mentioned the sun god's cattle, Helios's sacred herd grazing on the island of Thrinacia, She fixed them with a glare that froze the room. Touch them and you die. That's not a threat, it's a fact. The gods don't forgive hunger when it comes with defiance. The crew swore they wouldn't, but even Odysseus knew oaths don't fill an empty stomach. They left Circe's island with full supplies and heavier hearts. As the coastline fell away, Odysseus felt the strange pull of her gaze. Not unkind, not entirely kind either. For all her magic, she couldn't shield him from what lay ahead. The world was narrowing now. Every league of water pushed them closer to the gauntlet Tiresias had described. The wind carried them smoothly at first. The sea had that glassy calm sailors dread. Odysseus ordered the crew to plug their ears with wax as Circe had advised. Her warning about the sirens was clear. Their song sounds like whatever you want most, and once you hear it, you'll never want anything else. Odysseus had his men lash him to the mast, his ears unblocked. If I beg, if I scream, don't untie me, he told them, no matter what. By the time they neared the sirens' rocks, the air itself felt different, charged and expectant. The coastline was jagged, littered with the bones of ships and men. And then, faintly at first, the song began. It wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. It was soft, insinuating, a melody curling like smoke into the mind. Odysseus's eyes widened. He heard his name in their voices, promises of home without pain, of seeing his mother alive again, of a Troy won without blood on his hands. It was everything he wanted, handed to him in notes sweet as honey. He strained against the ropes, shouting for the men to turn the ship toward shore. His face was wild. They rowed harder, deaf to the song, deaf to his begging. The siren's song swelled, beautiful and terrible, and then faded as the ship slipped past their reach. Odysseus sagged against the mast, throat raw, the illusion broken. The men untied him only when the rocks were a dark smudge behind them. Surviving the sirens wasn't triumph. It was just the down payment on the terror waiting ahead. Ahead loomed the straits of Scylla and Charybdis, the passage so narrow no sailor could steer clear of both. To one side, the whirlpool roared, a maelstrom that clawed at the sea like a hungry god. To the other, the cliff face hid Scylla in its shadows, 6 long necks ending in jaws full of teeth. Circe's words rang in Odysseus's skull. Don't fight. Row hard and look ahead. He didn't tell the men about the 6 lives he'd already counted in his heart. Sometimes leadership means lying by omission. As they entered the strait, the roar of Charybdis was deafening. The men's eyes went wide as the whirlpool belched spray into the air, pulling the sea into its spinning throat. They kept their course tight to the rocks, oars flying. Odysseus forced himself to look up. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing, and then she struck. Scylla's heads lashed out faster than arrows. Screams tore the air as 6 men were plucked from the deck, found their legs kicking, voices vanishing into her maw. The rest of the crew rode blind with terror. Odysseus gripped the tiller, jaw locked against his own sob. And then, suddenly, it was done. The strait widened, the roar faded, and the empty spaces on the deck said everything. They rode on under a sky too bright, too clear, the kind of day that doesn't care what it's witnessed. Odysseus kept his eyes on the horizon, every muscle trembling. He'd survived the dead, the sirens, the monsters of the sea, but each victory was smaller than the cost. The sun hung low, glaring on the water like an unblinking eye. Beyond that eye waited Thrinacia and Helios's sacred cattle. The men didn't know it yet, but Odysseus felt the weight of prophecy settle deeper on his shoulders. The hardest choices were still ahead. The gods weren't finished, not by a long shot. The sea quieted after the straits, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that leaves space for fear to talk louder. The men rowed in exhausted silence, eyes averted from the 6 empty spots on deck where their friends once sat. Odysseus said nothing. His hands on the tiller felt heavier than bronze, and no speech in the world could lighten what Scylla had taken. The prophecy still rang in his head, each line a promise waiting to be kept. The sun burned overhead as they approached a long, low island. Grass swayed golden in the wind, and in the distance, sleek cattle moved lazily under the watch of unseen herdsmen. Odysseus felt his stomach turn. Tiresias had named this place. Helios's island, the one warning every god and prophet had repeated, don't touch the cattle. Don't even think about it. Hunger makes promises men can't keep. Odysseus gathered the crew before they landed. He told them exactly what awaited if they disobeyed storms, wreck, a god's vengeance. "Swear to me," he said, his voice rough. "No matter what happens, we leave the cattle untouched. We take only what the sea and the gods provide." They swore, hands raised, eyes solemn, but he knew oaths and empty bellies mix about as well as oil and fire. They made camp by the shore. For a month the wind howled off the sea, trapping them there. At first they ate what they'd brought from Circe's stores. When that ran out, they fished, dug for roots, gnawed on anything that looked remotely edible. The rain came and stayed. The men huddled under their cloaks, watching the fat, sacred cattle graze just out of reach. Every day was a battle between fear and starvation was winning. Odysseus prayed, sometimes to Zeus, sometimes to anyone listening. He went inland alone, begged the gods for mercy. Sleep finally dragged him down under a rock overhang. That's when Eurylochus whispered what they'd all been thinking. Better to die on the sea full than starve on land empty. "We'll offer the best of the herd to Helios. Maybe he'll forgive us." The others didn't argue. Hunger doesn't care about curses. The line between survival and sin is razor thin when your ribs show. By the time Odysseus woke, the deed was done. Smoke curled into the sky. The smell of roasting meat hung thick over the camp. He staggered back to find his men singing hymns to Helios over the crackle of burning fat. Their mouths were slick with grease, their eyes half mad with relief. Odysseus wanted to rage, to strike them down where they stood, but the sky answered first. A strange sound rippled across the island, a low, angry bellow. The hides of the slain cattle crawled with maggots, even as they sizzled on the fire. Their severed heads mooed in chorus, a sound no human throat could make. The men froze, terror dawning too late. Somewhere above the clouds, Helios had seen and heard. He would run straight to Zeus, demand vengeance. And Zeus rarely said no to family. For 6 more days. The storm winds stayed as they feasted on their doom. By the time they pushed off, the sky was black with bruised clouds. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat of judgment. When the bolt struck, it split mast and man alike. The ship shuddered, flung apart by the god's fury. Odysseus clung to a spar as his men screamed and vanished beneath the waves. The sea that had carried them so far took them all in one hungry breath. When the storm finally spat him out, there was no one left but Odysseus, alone on a makeshift raft, the taste of salt and ash in his mouth. The prophecy was almost complete. Behind him lay disobedience and death. Ahead, only the sea's long memory and a man who refused to stop fighting, even when there was nothing left to fight with. The sea carried him like a piece of wreckage, the sun and stars trading places above his head, while days blurred into one long ache. Salt crusted his lips. His hands bled from gripping the broken spar that kept him afloat. Every muscle screamed for rest. But sleep only came in shards, full of faces already gone. Odysseus was alone now, and the quiet was worse than any storm. There's no noise like the sound of no one left to call your name. The storm that killed his crew hadn't finished with him. On the 2nd day adrift, the horizon roared Charybdis again. The whirlpool Tiresias warned him of. The current pulled him toward its maw, and the sight froze his blood. The sea dropped away as if the world had been yanked out from under it, the whirlpool sucking everything toward its churning throat. No ship could survive it. Odysseus had no ship left to lose. It's one thing to face monsters with a crew. It's another to stare down death with no one to row but you. He clung to a fig tree clinging itself to the jagged rock above the vortex. The tree's roots bit into stone. His arms wrapped around it like a drowning child clutching a parent. The whirlpool roared beneath him, tearing at his raft, swallowing it whole. For hours he never knew how long he hung there, his body shaking, waiting for the sea to spit back what it had stolen. When Charybdis finally belched the shattered planks back to the surface, Odysseus dropped, caught what he could, and kicked hard. Pain tore through his legs, but pain meant he was still alive. The current carried him away, mercifully this time. He drifted for 9 days on open water, the sun beating him by day, the cold by night. He spoke to no one. There was no one to hear. He whispered Penelope's name anyway. Telemachus's too. Sometimes he swore he heard an answer in the wind, or saw a shape walking the waves. Maybe the gods pitied him. Maybe they just weren't done using him as a cautionary tale. On the 10th dawn, land shimmered on the horizon. His eyes were so salt-burned he thought it a trick, but as the sun climbed, the green outline sharpened. A river mouth spilled into the sea, and the scent of earth and flowers hit him like a forgotten dream. Phaeacia, the place the prophecy had dangled like a carrot, the home of people known for their ships and their kindness to strangers. Odysseus's fingers dug into the planks. Every stroke toward shore felt like swimming through stone. He collapsed face first in the sand, half dead, but fate wasn't done with him. A girl's laughter woke in Princess Nausicaa, and her maidens washing clothes in the river. To them, he must have looked like a wild animal, salt-caked and hollow-eyed. But Nausicaa didn't run. She stepped closer, linen in hand, and spoke with the kind of calm only the truly good seem to have. "Who are you, stranger?" she asked. "And what god has chased you here?" Sometimes salvation arrives not as a miracle, but as a girl with a basket of laundry. Odysseus forced himself to speak, humbled past the point of pride. He begged only for a scrap of cloth and a chance to see her parents. Nausicaa, moved, offered more food, clothing, and guidance to the palace of her father, King Alcinous. For the first time in what felt like years, Odysseus tasted bread baked by human hands, drank water not tainted with salt. His heart ached at the kindness. It was almost enough to make him believe home wasn't a cruel joke. As the sun set over Phaeacia, Odysseus followed the princess's cart toward the palace, limping but alive. The walls ahead glowed in the twilight, and inside waited the first real hope he'd had since leaving Troy. Whether the gods meant it as mercy, or just the next twist in the knife, he couldn't know. But for now, the sand was solid under his feet, and that was enough. The palace of Alcinous glimmered like something out of a dream. Bronze doors shone in the torchlight, and the scent of roasted meats and blooming orchards drifted on the evening breeze. Odysseus, still wearing the simple linen Nausicaa had given him, felt out of place in its splendor. Salt clung to his skin, his hair hung in ragged tangles, and yet every pair of eyes he passed held only curiosity, not scorn. Nausicaa led him to the threshold and whispered, "Fall at my mother's knees first. She has the kindest heart." Inside, Queen Arete sat beside her husband, Alcinous. The hall filled with music and the low murmur of guests. When Odysseus crossed the room and knelt at her feet, the hall fell silent. His voice was hoarse but steady as he begged for mercy food, shelter, and passage home. No boasts, no riddles, just a man worn down to the core asking for help. Sometimes true strength is putting down your pride long enough to ask. Arete lifted him with surprising gentleness. "You have suffered," she said simply, and that was all it took. Servants brought warm baths and clean robes. Platters of food appeared as if conjured. Odysseus ate like a starving man, because he was one. The Phaeacians listened in respectful silence, sensing the weight of his grief even without knowing his name. That night, a feast was held in his honor. Musicians played, dancers spun in gold light. Alcinous asked who he was, where he'd come from, and why the gods had sent him here half dead on their shores. Odysseus hesitated. The hall was too warm, too safe. Speaking his name felt like tempting fate. But the bard struck up a song about the Trojan War, about a wooden horse and a city in flames, and the memories broke loose. He wept openly. The room blurred, the music faltered. "You ask who I am," he said at last. "I am Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes. I fought at Troy. I've been trying to get home ever since." Then, as if the words themselves unlocked a floodgate, he told them everything. The ambush at Ismarus, the lotus, the Cyclops, the storms, the dead. He spoke of Circe, of Scylla's 6 snapping heads, of watching his men die again and again. The hall hung on every word, even the children silent. A story can wound, but it can also save. It reminds you you're still human. When he finished, the hall didn't erupt with cheers. Instead, there was a hush, a kind of reverence for a man who had endured what no one should. Alcinous rose and swore before all that Odysseus would see Ithaca again. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will fit our best ship. My captains will row you themselves. No man leaves my hall a beggar." That night Odysseus lay in a real bed, the first in years, and sleep came without nightmares. For once, he didn't dream of drowning or monsters. He dreamed of olive trees and the smell of Penelope's loom. The gods had brought him this far. Whether it was mercy or a pause before the final storm, he didn't know. But dawn would come soon, and with it the journey's last leg, the one that mattered most. In the dark, he whispered their names again. Penelope, Telemachus, Ithaca. He didn't need the stars to guide him anymore. Hope was enough to chart the course. Tomorrow, the oars would dip into the water one last time, and every pull would carry him closer to the door he'd been trying to open for 20 years. Dawn thinned into the kind of blue that makes islands feel like memories. Odysseus stood a long time in the cove, listening to Ithaca breathe. The cicadas wound up. A hawk carved a slow figure 8 above the cliff. He hid the Phaeacian gifts bronze, gold, fine cloth in a cave behind a spill of stone, covering the mouth with brush the way a hunter hides a snare. Then he knelt, pressed his palm to the earth again, and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the right kind of prayer. Footsteps scraped on rock behind him. He rose with his hand already half to the knife he didn't have. A shepherd boy stood there, hazel eyes bright, a curl of a smile like he knew every story the island had ever told. "Rough morning for a man who's just come home," the boy said. "Home asks questions." Odysseus answered, playing along. "Who are you to ask them someone who never liked long introductions?" The boy's shape blurred. The air smelled faintly of olive wood after rain. When it cleared, Athena was there tall, unblinking, the calm in a storm's quiet centre. Odysseus bowed until his forehead nearly touched the sand. "You've made it farther than most mortals I've bothered to watch," she said, and there was that hint of fondness she tried to hide. "But don't mistake arriving for finishing. I know what waits," he said. "Men feeding on what isn't theirs. My wife trapped in a siege without walls. My son trying to be a man with jackals at his table. And your name in the mouths of fools," Athena added. "That's the part that always gets me." He let himself smile. "You could cut them off." "I could," she said, "but where's the lesson in that?" Her eyes sharpened. "Listen, you can't walk into your hall as Odysseus. Not yet. We do this my way. Your way saved me more than once. My way keeps you alive one more time." She reached, and the world tipped. The years on the sea climbed onto his back. His spine bowed. Grey crept into his beard. Grime and years dulled his skin. His cloak frayed. His feet hardened into a beggar's feet. It wasn't a trick of light. It was a different truth. Odysseus flexed his hands, old, knotted, unfamiliar. "You could have just given me a helmet," he said. "Helmets are for men who still believe the world is straightforward." She nodded toward the goat track switchbacking up the hill. "There's a swineherd 2 valleys over, Eumaeus. Loyal. Smart enough to keep his head down. Brave enough not to look away when it matters. Go to him. Sleep under his roof. Listen. Learn the shape of your own island again. I'll fetch your boy. Telemachus." "He left in search of you," Athena said. "Not unkindly. Brave. Reckless. Both in ways that make me proud and nervous. The suitors mean to ambush him on his way home. I'll see him pass their knives." Odysseus felt something loosen in his chest that had held a knot for 20 years. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when you've counted bodies and washed your hands of their blood without losing the part of you that kept walking all this time." Her gaze softened a fraction. "Go, and remember, mercy is a choice. So is wrath. Choose carefully." She vanished the way gods do, as if you'd blinked at the wrong time. Odysseus stood alone with his borrowed age and the weight of a homecoming that wasn't ready to have him. He took the goat path at a beggar's pace, testing the disguise on his bones. The island slowly unscrolled terraces like fingerprints cut into the hillside, skeins of dry stone wall, the silver shimmer of olive leaves scratching at the wind. He passed a shepherd and a boy. They looked through him. It stung and then soothed. Invisibility could be its own armor. By late afternoon he reached a rough fence where pigs rooted and grunted in their little kingdoms. Smoke rose from a low-roofed hut shouldered into the hill to keep the wind off. A man stood in the doorway broad-shouldered, dark-haired, gone to iron at the temples, hands nicked with old cuts. He saw the stranger and didn't reach for a spear. He stepped aside. "Come in, friend," the man said. "A poor house, but mine. You'll eat what I eat." There was pride there, and a kind of sadness that had learned to keep quiet. Odysseus bowed his borrowed head. "I've known worse roofs," he said. "I'm Eumaeus," the man added, as if apologizing for not being someone richer. "Pigs don't make you noble, but they make you honest." The hut smelled like smoke and thyme and the clean funk of animal. Eumaeus set a stool by the fire, cut meat with clean, quick hands, and poured watered wine into a rough cup. He didn't ask questions first. He fed the man first. Odysseus felt the food land like warmth in a place that had been cold for years. "You've come far," Eumaeus said finally. "The road clings to a man like that. Far enough to be homesick for places I never want to see again," Odysseus said. He kept his eyes on the fire. "What news? Friend, I hear laughter sometimes, even out on the goat trails. Laughter that sounds like it doesn't belong to men who paid for the right to laugh here." Eumaeus's jaw worked. They came like rain that forgot how to stop. At first we thought they were bringing comfort to the queen. Then we saw the ledger. They eat our fields bald, drink our cellars dry, break the backs of the boys who carry their water. They call it courtship. I call it theft. And the queen Penelope. His mouth softened. "She's been a lighthouse in fog. She weaves by day and unweaves by night to play time itself like a fool. I know it can't last. But the gods love a woman who refuses to lose with grace." And the boy Odysseus asked, "Careful with the word. Telemachus is trying to grow up under a roof that hates the idea." Eumaeus glanced toward the door, as if the island itself might be listening. He left to find his father. Poor kid thinks names are maps. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're just names. Odysseus swallowed a dozen answers. Instead, he told the kind of lie that hides a truth. "I knew your king. Once," he said. "A man like a well-built boat, balanced, stubborn, making the sea do what he needed even when it didn't want to. He's alive." Eumaeus's eyes flicked up so fast it hurt to watch. "Don't do that to me," he said softly. "Hope's expensive. We're not rich." "He's alive," Odysseus repeated, and despite the disguise and the careful distance, something in his voice made it sound less like a story and more like a receipt. Eumaeus nodded like he'd fight the whole island to protect that sentence. "Eat," he said gruffly. "Sleep. In the morning we'll talk about how to keep you from getting your head cracked for sport." They ate by firelight. Eumaeus told him small things that mattered, which herdsman could be trusted, which servant had a spine, which road stayed quiet at dusk. He didn't gossip. He mapped. Outside, the pigs settled, a low choir of snorts. When the night deepened, Eumaeus took his only cloak off the peg and laid it over the stranger's shoulders. "Cold gets in the bones when it smells a man alone," he said. "No offence." "None taken," Odysseus said, and meant it in ways Eumaeus couldn't know. He didn't sleep at first. He listened to the wind, to the pigs, to Eumaeus's even breathing. The island murmured the way a house does when the last person is finally asleep. For once, the noises felt like company. Far across the water, then not so far another ship cut a midnight seam through the sea. Telemachus stood near the prow, cloak tight, eyes fixed on the strip of stars that always points home if you've learned how to listen. Athena had found him in Sparta in the shape of a stranger with decent advice and better timing. She'd slid her counsel into his ear. "Leave now. Avoid the main harbour. Men who drink your wine by day plan to drink your blood by night." He'd believed her because something in him had already guessed. In Pylos, in Sparta, he'd collected fragments of his father's name like a man picking shells after a storm. Beautiful. Broken. Telling him less than he hoped and more than he wanted. Menelaus had spoken kindly. Helen had watched him with that sharp, far-seeing look that made you wonder if she saw you at all or only the history around you. They'd given him gifts and truths with their edges sanded. "Your father is the kind of man trouble doesn't forget," Menelaus had said. It was meant to be praise. It sounded like a warning. Now, the coast of Ithaca thickened out of darkness. "Don't go to the main harbour," Athena had said. "They'll be waiting between reef and rock, nets of steel and malice ready." Telemachus turned the ship toward a smaller cove, a fisher's place where the cliffs leaned close and the shore offered only a goat path for welcome. "Keep your mouths shut and your hands steady." He told the few men loyal enough to risk the trip. If we live through the night, I'll pay you with something better than gold. They didn't ask what. Men who sail at night for someone else understand the currencies that matter. They grounded the ship without a sound, carrying the gifts up past the tide line to a stash place known to men who do things no one writes down. Telemachus stood a moment with his palm on a rock worn smooth by 100 years of rain and salt. Father, he thought, not even sure if he meant it as a prayer. A gull barked once as if to answer that prayers aren't the only mail service gods use. He didn't head for the halls. He started uphill the way shepherds do, turning into the land's folds until he found the old track to the swine grounds. The moon laid the island out like a silver map. In the great hall back toward the sea, the suitors nursed their ugly patients, knives oiled, tongues ready. On the headland above the main harbour, men waited without smiling, eyes on the water where they were sure their quarry would glow like a lure fish. They'd miss him tonight by a valley and a thought. At the hut. Eumaeus woke before dawn. Swineherds know the habits of light. He stoked the fire and sliced bread with that perfect economy of motion that comes from making do. He looked at the stranger sleeping near the hearth and felt that ache again the one hope makes even when you don't want it. He stepped outside to piss and saw a tall shape moving down the path. Cloak hooded, stride careful, but not afraid. For a heartbeat his hand went to the stick by the door. Then the figure raised a palm in a greeting. You learn at your first naming day. Eumaeus, the young man said, pulling the hood back. The swineherd made a noise that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob. By the roots of every olive I've ever trimmed, he said. You're back. Telemachus opened his arms and was 13 again for the space of a heartbeat, letting the old man wrap him in the kind of embrace that tells you your name is safe on someone else's tongue. Then he stepped back, trying on the weight of the man he was trying to be. I came by the North Cove, he said. They're waiting at the main harbour. Of course they are, Eumaeus said. Men who can't make anything have to be good at waiting to take it. Inside. The beggar stirred and sat up, cloak sliding off his shoulders. Telemachus saw him and tensed an instinct born of months of learning how to walk into rooms full of men who wanted him gone. Eumaeus set a hand on his arm. A traveller, he said. Found him with the pigs. Fed him. That's how we do in a decent country. Telemachus tilted his head, studying the stranger. Old eyes, young fire shuttered behind them, hands that remembered work more than begging. For a second, something like recognition wavered across the space between them and then vanished, leaving the polite distance strangers keep. Welcome, Telemachus said. We don't have much, but what we have we share. The beggar Odysseus, in all the ways that mattered, bowed his head to hide how the words hit him. You can know your son's face only from the edges, the way he stands, the way he speaks like he built the sentence with his own hands. He wanted to stand up and say his name. He wanted to grab the boy by the shoulders and say every apology that could be said and some that couldn't. He said none of it. He drank the watered wine Eumaeus offered and watched his son watch him. They sat together, 3 men in a hut that could barely hold their combined fate. Eumaeus told Telemachus everything, the tricks, the petty cruelties, the big ones that pretended to be jokes. He spoke of Penelope's weaving, of her face going still when the suitors made their ugliest boasts. He spoke of servants who'd sold their loyalty for an extra slice of meat, and those who still had spines. Telemachus listened with his jaw clenched until the bones popped. We'll need allies, he said. A few good hands in the right place. You don't need a dozen, Eumaeus answered. You need the right 3. Odysseus watched the boy think like a captain infantry. Terrain. Timing. It warmed and hurt in the same breath. When Eumaeus stepped outside to check the pens, the room thinned into a different kind of quiet. Telemachus turned to the stranger. What do you think of our odds? The boy asked with a forced lightness that didn't have room to hide its fear. I think men who take more than they can carry always trip, Odysseus said. His voice stayed low, the island's cadence tucked at the edges. And I think houses remember their owners if the owners remember how to walk in. Telemachus blinked. You sound like someone who knows us. I know a lot of houses, Odysseus said. He almost smiled. They all have the same doors? Eumaeus came back in and spoiled the spell by being practical. I'll go down to the hall and let your mother know you're back, he told Telemachus. But I won't say it loud. I'll say it to the right ears. The wrong ones collect news like taxes. Telemachus nodded. Take the back paths. If anyone asks, you're selling a pig to a priest too pious to bargain. Eumaeus grinned without joy. Priests don't bargain. They pretend not to and then do it better than anyone. He clapped the stranger on the shoulder. "Watch him," he told Telemachus, jerking his chin toward Odysseus. "He's got the kind of luck that looks like trouble until you read the last line." When the door thumped shut behind him, the hut felt smaller and larger at once. Telemachus poured more wine and stared into the fire. The storm he'd been holding back since boyhood finally found a crack. "I don't know if he's alive," he said, not looking up. "Some days I think I'd rather hear he's dead than keep asking a question that doesn't answer." The beggar's breath caught. "You'd take a clean pain over a long one," he said. "Most men would. I'm tired of walking into my own hall like I need permission. I'm tired of watching my mother pretend she can't hear them when they brag about what they'll do when they're kings in all but name." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'm tired of looking like him more every day and not knowing if the man I'm becoming is a good sentence or a warning." Odysseus's hands trembled in his lap. He'd taken Poseidon's curses, Zeus's bolts, the dead's accusations, the siren's lies, and kept moving. This boy's voice nearly undid him. He stared at the floor and counted 1, 2, 3 until he remembered what Athena had told him. "My way." "Listen," he said finally. "If your father were to walk through that door, he'd ask you one question first." "What's that?" "Are you willing to do what comes next?" Telemachus met the stranger's eyes and didn't flinch. "Yes." The hut's shadow shifted. The air thickened the way it does when storms change course just offshore. Athena stood where the doorway had been a breath ago, not bothering with disguises now that only 2 men faced her. Telemachus kept his seat, but his head bowed without thinking. Some gestures come with the blood. "Close enough," she said. "Time to stop measuring and start cutting." Odysseus rose, and the years fell off him like a cloak shaken free of rain. The stoop straightened. The grime washed from his skin without water. The grey retreated. In the space of a heartbeat, the stranger who spoke in riddles became the man in Telemachus's bones, the line of the jaw, the angle of the shoulders, the way the eyes asked and commanded in the same look. Telemachus stood so fast the stool skittered and fell. For a moment he didn't move, like his body had to check twice before it trusted the world. Then he closed the distance in 2 strides, and was a child and a man at once, fists clutching his father's cloak, forehead pressed against the place under a warrior's collarbone where boys have always learned how their fathers smell. Odysseus wrapped his arms around his son and felt 20 years fold the weight of every mile, every wave, every name he'd said out loud in the dark with no answer. He didn't say "I'm sorry," because sorry is a small word for a big thing. He said, "I'm here," because sometimes that's the only spell that matters. Athena gave them time, the exact right amount, not a breath more. Then she put the business back in the room. "Listen," she said, and the fire seemed to lean toward her. "We'll do this with hands and heads, not prayers and hoping. Here's the shape of it." She mapped it out. Eumaeus would carry word to Penelope that her son was safe and a stranger had come who might be more than he seemed. Telemachus would return to the hall by a different door than the one the suitors watched. All careless ease and the kind of lie that looks like truth when spoken by a man who has learned to control his heartbeat. Odysseus would follow later as the beggar, back in the borrowed age, the better to see who mocked and who helped. "You'll hide the weapons," Athena told Telemachus. "Pull the good blades and bows from the hall, every spear worth the effort, and lock them in the storeroom. Leave a few trash pieces on the wall, enough for a joke and not enough for a battle. If anyone asks, say you're protecting them from the smoke. Men who use words like honour over their wine don't know how to argue with smoke." And the servants Telemachus asked, "Some are ours, some are theirs." "You know the difference," Athena said. "Men tell you who they are when they think you can't take anything from them." And Penelope Odysseus asked, voice small on her name. "She'll test you," Athena said. "She has a right to pass every test, fail none." A rare smile ghosted her face. "She's the best player in the house. Don't forget it." They worked details the way carpenters work a joint measure: shave, test, repeat. If a man coughed in the hall, if a servant slipped out at the wrong hour, if a dog barked every thread woven into the cloth of the plan, it was the kind of thinking Odysseus loved, the kind that made hardship make sense. Telemachus kept up, eyes narrowing where they should, widening at the right risks. Twice he suggested something better than his father had, and both times Athena nodded like a teacher who enjoys being outpaced. When the last piece set, when the hut held more purpose than air. Athena looked at them both with that measuring gaze gods must practice in mirrors. "You'll bleed," she said. "You'll kill. You'll wonder if you've become the worst version of yourselves. You won't. Not if you remember why this house matters. What if Poseidon Telemachus started? Let me worry about my relatives," Athena said dryly. "Rivers have their ways of wearing down rock. So do daughters." She was gone before the joke finished leaving her mouth. The hut breathed again like a man released from a grip. Odysseus lifted the bow Eumaeus kept on pegs over the door, a good country piece. Not the king's weapon, but honest, and tested the string with a gentle pluck. The note was low, eager. Telemachus watched his hands and saw the future shaking itself awake. "You'll need to get used to looking past me like you don't know me," Odysseus said. "I've been doing that to my father my whole life," Telemachus said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a fact turned soft with use. Eumaeus came back at last, dust to his knees, sweat shiny on his brow, news tight in his mouth. "She knows you're back," he told Telemachus. She didn't cry where anyone could pocket her tears. She went to her room and looked at the empty loom a while. "I think she's been building a different kind of net with that thread." And the suitors Odysseus asked. "Happy in the dumb way cattle are," Eumaeus said. "They've got their knives oiled with your oil and their jokes sharpened on your plates. They heard about the ambush not working and decided not to worry about small details like that. Men who live off other men's names always think the house will keep feeding them forever." Odysseus's mouth went a line. "Tomorrow," he said. "We go in tomorrow, tonight. We sleep while the island remembers us." No one argued. They ate the kind of meal men eat when the next day will ask for everything bread that tasted like earth and work. Meat that tasted like the animal had had a decent life. They spoke very little. Words needed saving for the part where words would matter more than steel. When the lamp was down to a nub, Odysseus lay on the floor again, Eumaeus's cloak over him, and stared at the roof an inch above his face. Telemachus slept with the gracelessness of the truly exhausted, one arm flung out, hand open. Odysseus reached across the small distance and set his fingers lightly on his son's knuckles. Not enough to wake him, enough to rest. Outside, the pigs shifted in their sleep, dreaming pig dreams of mud and sun. The wind came off the sea and walked the ridges, carrying salt and something newer anticipation. Maybe, or whatever it is that collects in corners before a house remembers how strong it is. In the great hall, the suitors argued over whether victory is better drunk from a wide cup or a deep one. In Penelope's chamber, a woman stared at a door and measured it in heartbeats, not hinges. On the headland above the main harbour, men finally gave up waiting for a ship that had slipped past them like a thought they weren't clever enough to think. And in a swineherd's hut halfway between the sea and the house that would fit or reject them, a father and son slept on the same floor for the first time in 20 years. Morning would bring masks and tests, insults and blood, a bow that remembered an old, fierce song. For now, the island held them. For now, the gods let them breathe. Tomorrow, a beggar walks into a palace, a prince pretends not to know his father, and a house that forgot itself gets its name back the hard way. The sun rose sharp and clear, the kind of morning that looks innocent until you remember what's planned for it. Odysseus stirred before the pigs, before Eumaeus's steady footsteps around the yard. He slipped back into the disguise Athena had given him, the bent back, the grey beard, the weathered skin of a man no one would fear. Telemachus watched quietly, learning how a hero becomes a ghost when the work calls for it. They left the hut with the smell of ash still in their cloaks, taking the back paths Eumaeus had mapped. The island stretched ahead, olive groves, stone fences, the hum of bees in time. It looked so unchanged it hurt. Odysseus leaned heavier on his stick and let the mask sit deep. The palace waited, a lion's den disguised as home. Walking into danger is easier when it doesn't look like danger. They reached the outer courtyard by mid-morning. Dogs barked, tails stiff. For a heartbeat, Odysseus feared they'd know him even through the disguise. But Athena had thought of that. The animals sniffed and backed away, whining softly as if they'd smelled a memory. One old hound didn't move at all, Argos, sprawled on a pile of dung, his fur patchy, eyes dim. At the sound of his master's voice greeting Eumaeus, the dog's tail thumped weakly. Odysseus turned his face so the swineherd wouldn't see the tears. After 20 years, The dog had waited for him, and when he knew his master was home, Argos let out a soft sigh and died. Odysseus walked into his hall not as a king but as a beggar, and that's exactly how they treated him. The suitors lounged on his chairs, drinking his wine, gnawing bones from his herds. Laughter rang off the rafters, brittle and cruel. No one asked permission before insulting him. They barely noticed him until Antinous, the worst of them, sneered at the newcomer. Another mouth to feed from scraps, he said. Maybe he'll dance for our amusement. Eumaeus offered the polite introduction due even to strangers, but the mockery swelled. One threw a crust at Odysseus. Another muttered a joke about how the queen's hospitality extended too far. Through it all, Odysseus hunched, asking only for crumbs. Telemachus played his part well, feigning mild concern but no recognition, letting the suitors think him weak. Every insult was a thread in the net they'd spring later. Antinous crossed the line. When Odysseus asked him directly for bread, Antinous' face twisted with contempt. He hurled a stool. It struck Odysseus' shoulder with a crack that made the hall pause. For a breath, the room watched the old beggar sway. His fingers twitched like they wanted a bow. But he stayed in character, muttered a prayer for justice instead of revenge. The gods were listening. Mircea's patience sharpened into a weapon. Penelope heard the commotion from her chamber. Word travelled fast how the suitors mocked a beggar under her roof. She sent for Eumaeus, wanting to speak to the stranger. Eumaeus promised to deliver the message quietly. Penelope didn't yet know who the beggar was, but something in her heart pricked awake. Her weaving scheme had bought years, but time was running thin. In the hall, Odysseus took the measure of each man who laughed loudest, who looked uneasy, who eyed Telemachus with a snake's patience. Melanthius the goatherd snickered with the suitors. A few of the serving women flitted around with eyes too eager to please. Odysseus tucked each name away. He begged from table to table. Some gave him crusts, others jeered. Every act marked the line between who might live tomorrow and who wouldn't. As evening settled, the suitors called for entertainment a fight between the beggar and another drifter. They jeered and promised sausage as a prize. The other beggar, Iris, puffed himself up, eager to beat an old man. Odysseus rose slowly, shrugging off his rags enough for his shoulders cords of muscle to show. The suitors roared at the sight, betting on the fight like it was a game. Odysseus dropped Iris with one punch, careful not to kill him. The hall howled with laughter at Iris's groans, too drunk on cruelty to see the storm behind the beggar's eyes. Telemachus hid a smile. The gods hid theirs less well. Night came with torches sputtering and the stench of wine heavy. The suitors stumbled to bed, calling over their shoulders to Penelope as if she were already theirs. She descended briefly, her face calm, and announced she'd soon choose a husband. It was part of her plan. One more thread in the web. Odysseus watched her from the shadows, his heart pounding with love and fury and something else, admiration. A house isn't brick and wood. It's the people who know how to hold it. When Penelope left, Odysseus bedded down on the hall's floor like any beggar. Melantho, one of the disloyal maids, mocked him. He endured it. Tomorrow or the next day, the reckoning would come. Tonight, patience was his sword. Outside, the moon climbed over Ithaca, pale and sharp. Inside, the beggar who was a king closed his eyes and listened to the house breathe. It remembered him, and soon. Everyone under its roof would remember too, in blood or in mercy. The choice would be theirs. Sleep didn't come easy. The suitors' voices carried from their chambers, loud with drunken boasts. Telemachus shifted on his pallet nearby, pretending to dream. Odysseus's hand brushed the invisible bowstring in his mind, taut and waiting. Above, on Olympus. Athena's gaze didn't waver. The stage was set. The next act would draw blood. The torches in the hall burned low, their smoke curling toward the rafters like snakes too tired to strike. Most of the suitors lay sprawled in wine-heavy sleep, their snores competing with the buzz of flies. Odysseus sat awake against a pillar, the guise of an old beggar still draped over him, mind sharp as a drawn bow. Tonight wasn't about vengeance yet. It was about testing the heart of the house. Penelope moved like a shadow from her chamber, the lamplight trailing her in gold. Her face was calm, but her eyes were two storms behind shutters, She gestured quietly for the beggar to follow her to a quieter corner away from the drunken heap of men. When she spoke, her voice carried the weariness of 20 years and the steel of a woman who had outwitted wolves every single day. "You endured their insults better than I can," she said softly, "and you took that stool without a curse on your lips. Either you're a fool or you've seen worse." Odysseus kept his voice low, gravelly. "I've seen worse," he said, "and I've seen houses healed when patience outlasted greed." Her eyes searched his face, seeing the beggar and someone else layered beneath. "Stranger, tell me truly. You claim you've met my husband before. Tell me, how did he look? What did he wear? When you last saw him, it was a test, subtle and razor-sharp." Odysseus spun a tale with perfect detail, the brooch of a hound biting its prey, the tunic Penelope herself had woven. He described Odysseus's mannerisms, the scar on his leg earned from a wild boar long ago. As he spoke, Penelope's breath caught. She believed him and didn't, hope and caution wrestling inside her chest. Hope is the cruelest and kindest guest, it never leaves politely. Tears welled despite her control. She wiped them quickly. "If what you say is true, stranger, the gods are cruel to make me wait. 20 years of weaving and unweaving, of men devouring this house." Her voice dropped. "Sometimes I think I'll give them what they want, just to end the siege." Odysseus's hands clenched under his ragged cloak. "Don't," he said, a flash of command under the disguise. "He's closer than you think." She stared at him hard, as if some part of her already knew, but she only said, "We'll see who the gods favour. Tomorrow I will set a contest. Whoever can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow clean through 12 axe heads will win my hand." A faint, dangerous smile ghosted her lips. "They think it's for them. It's not." Odysseus's heart surged at her cunning. This was the Penelope he dreamed of, the woman who could match his mind note for note. "A wise contest," he said. "Your husband would approve." She left with the lamp, her figure fading into the darkness, but her plan blazed bright in the beggar's mind. Athena's timing, as always, was flawless. As the hall settled into its last hour of darkness, Odysseus rose quietly. There was one more test tonight, one more heart to weigh. He padded softly to where the old nurse Euryclea kept watch. Her hair was silver, her hands knotted with years of service, yet her eyes were sharp. When he asked for a basin to wash his feet, she grumbled like always but brought it. As she bent to wash him, her fingers brushed the scar on his leg, the same he had described to Penelope. Her hands froze. The basin tipped. Water splashed on the floor. She stared up at him, mouth opening with a cry ready to rattle the roof. Odysseus caught her wrist gently but firmly. "Hush, old friend," he whispered. "It's me. And yes, the day you've prayed for is coming, but not a word. Not yet." Tears streaked her worn face. She pressed her forehead to his knee like the child she'd once nursed. "You're home," she whispered. "I knew the gods wouldn't let them win. Recognition can be louder than any shout if it happens in the quiet. Keep my secret," Odysseus said. "By tomorrow night, you'll see what this house remembers." Euryclea swore by every god she knew. She would help point out which servants had stayed loyal, which had sold their souls for scraps of suitors' meat. Odysseus nodded, storing every detail. When the nurse left to tend the lamps, he sat again against the pillar, cloak pulled around him. The hall smelled of wine and ash and the last night of arrogance. Some of the suitors stirred briefly, muttering in their sleep. Antinous dreamed of a crown he'd never wear. Eurymachus snored, clutching a cup he'd stolen. Melanthius, the treacherous goatherd, slipped out once to the courtyard, eyes darting like a rat's. Odysseus marked it all in silence. The first hint of dawn painted the sky pale grey. The beggar closed his eyes for an hour's rest, the weight of tomorrow humming in his bones. By evening, bows would sing, axes would split, and names would be written in blood. For now, there was only the soft rasp of Telemachus breathing nearby, and the steady beat of Odysseus's heart calling the house back to itself. Tomorrow the net would tighten. Tonight the storm gathered quietly under an old man's rags. Morning broke crisp and bright, a cruel contrast to the storm coiled inside the palace walls. The suitors awoke with hangovers and swagger, calling for meat and wine before the sun had fully climbed. Penelope stood calm among them, her loom abandoned, her face the mask of a queen who had survived too long to be rushed now. She announced her contest as promised. Odysseus's bow would be brought out, and whoever could string it and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads would win her hand. Laughter erupted like dry sticks snapping. Antinous smirked. A woman's trick. No man alive can string that bow but a god or the husband you pretend still lives. His words dripped honey and venom. He didn't know they were prophecy. Arrogance is a blade you sharpen on your own throat. Telemachus, playing his part with steady nerves, carried the great bow into the hall. The suitors passed it among themselves, smirking and boasting. One by one they tried to string it. One by one they failed. Muscles bulged, sweat beaded on brows, curses flew. The bow stayed unbent, its string slack like a sleeping serpent waiting for its master's touch. Antinous grunted and passed it off with a sneer. Eurymachus cursed that the leather had stiffened with age. Melanthius joked about soaking it in fat. None of them noticed the beggar watching from the pillar's shadow, hands itching to feel what had been his all along. When all had failed, Odysseus spoke up, voice mild. "May I try?" The hall erupted again, mockery, outrage, disbelief. Antinous jeered. "You, an old tramp who begged crumbs from my table, will you snap your brittle fingers trying Penelope?" With a calm that made some shift uneasily, said, "Let the stranger try. It is my contest. Who are you to refuse?" Her words landed sharp as any spear. Telemachus echoed her, feigning youthful rebellion. "Mother speaks true. Let him test his luck." Grumbling, the suitors agreed. Telemachus cleared the floor, lined the axe heads as tradition demanded. The beggar shuffled forward, rags trailing. He took the bow in his hands with a familiarity that made Eurycleia cover her mouth to stifle a sob. The wood sang under his touch. Without strain, he bent it, strung it, and plucked the string. The sound hummed through the hall like thunder under a clear sky. Recognition doesn't always need a name. Sometimes it's a sound you haven't heard in 20 years. Odysseus set an arrow on the string, aimed with the calm of a man greeting an old friend. The shaft flew clean through all 12 axe heads. Gasps filled the hall. Some thought it a miracle. Others felt the first cold prickle of dread. Odysseus didn't wait for either to settle. He turned, another arrow already in hand. His voice rang out, stripped of disguise. "You thought I was gone. You thought this house was yours. I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and your feast is over." Antinous barely had time to blink before the arrow struck his throat. Wine sprayed as he fell, the cup still in his hand. Chaos erupted. Some lunged for weapons, only to find the rack's bare Telemachus had done his work. Others screamed for mercy, tripping over benches. Odysseus stood unshaken, the bow singing death with every draw. Telemachus dashed to his father's side, spear in hand now. Eumaeus and Philoetius, the loyal herdsmen, burst in through the side door with hidden armor and blades. Together they formed a wall of fury. Arrows flew, spears thrust. Eurymachus tried to plead, tried to blame Antinous for everything, then charged like a cornered boar. Odysseus's arrow caught him square in the chest. The hall became a storm of reckoning. Melanthius tried to sneak to the storeroom for arms, but was caught and bound. The disloyal maids who'd mocked their queen shrieked. Their time would come. Blood slicked the floors where stolen wine had spilled for years. Athena watched unseen, her favour like a shield around those she chose. Justice doesn't whisper. When it arrives, it thunders. When the last suitor fell, the hall was silent except for the rasp of Odysseus's breath and the drip of blood. He stood in the centre, bow lowered now, eyes blazing, not with rage, but with the hard light of a man who's carried a name too long to let it be stolen. Telemachus stood beside him, shoulders squared. The loyal servants knelt. Penelope appeared on the stair, her face unreadable. She looked at him a long moment. "My husband," she said softly, a question and an answer all at once. Odysseus lowered the bow. "Your waiting is over." The house exhaled. Outside, Ithaca's wind carried the smell of salt and blood, a reminder that even after 20 years, home isn't given, it's taken back. Tonight, The hall would be washed, the floors scrubbed, the dead buried. But in this breath, justice had returned, and for the first time in 2 decades, Ithaca belonged again to its king and queen,